You're influential. You have the power to change yourself. You have the power to influence others. But what he talks about, he says that most people in their repertoire, they only have one or two or three methods of influence that they've mastered. So one method of influence is persuasion. I try to persuade someone, and when I can't persuade that person, he says, what happens? Automatically, the fight or flight gene kicks in, which happens to me maybe 15 times a day. Fight or flight. It's a part of our brains, the lower stem brain, where our amygdala is. They call it amygdala hijack. And scholars who talk about evolution, they say that it was there in our evolutionary history because we needed to protect ourselves from, I don't know, woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and other tribes that were trying to attack us. That fear instinct. So he says that most people, what they do is that they'll try to persuade, they'll try to influence, but then when they can't, the fight or flight gene kicks in. So they're either very passive or very aggressive. Either get out of there, they'll leave, or they'll fight. And sometimes they'll freeze, fight or flight or freeze. But he talks about, he says, when it comes to your influence, it's not just confrontation. So there's confrontation, which is holding someone accountable. So if someone is not living up to a promise that they made, you can confront them, which is to hold them accountable. And there's ways to do that. There's influence by example. You set the right example. Narration tells us that one day that Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhum salam, they were children, and they taught, all of you have heard this narration, that they taught a man how to properly perform wudu by example. They didn't need to say anything. They did not see themselves in a position at 7 or 8 or 9 years old to tell a man who was their senior, hey, you're doing it wrong. They could have confronted him, but instead of confronting, their type of influence was example. And each situation requires a different method of influence. He describes empathy as a form of influence. Sometimes just having empathy with someone. What is empathy? Empathy is the ability to feel other people's feelings. Have you noticed some people, naturally, they have empathy. They can tell when another person is sad, even if they're smiling. They can tell if another person is hurting. That's called empathy. You know, they started doing studies, and all this falls under the category of emotional intelligence. There's a great book written on emotional intelligence by Daniel Goleman. And he says that they did studies, and they found that children at very young ages, babies, started to display empathy. How? They'd say that they started to conduct experiments, and one child would begin to cry because the baby wanted its mom. The mom would not respond, so the other baby that was with it would begin to cry, not because it's hurting, but because it wanted attention from its own mom, saying, come to the rescue. They had empathy. They could feel that sadness, and that sadness affects their own state. So sometimes just having empathy with someone is very influential. There's an example from the life of Imam al-Hasan al-Mujtaba alayhi salam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And some of you have heard this, but it's such a powerful example where a man comes to him in Medina from Damascus, and he comes in with ill intentions. He greets him, and he was a brainwashed man. He was an ignorant man. You know, Muawiyah had worked for many years to brainwash people. He was the equivalent of the big media companies today. He knew how to employ people to write on his behalf, to produce on his behalf, and brainwash people. So this man comes in with ill will. He identifies the Imam, and he starts to curse at him. He starts to swear at him. And he's just being nasty, he's being mean with him. Now the Imam had a number of things he could have done to influence. He could have, the fight or flight gene could have kicked in. He's a human being. He could have just left and walked away, or he could have confronted him. But he saw that this man was hurting on the inside. He had empathy. He could feel the pain that was on the inside. And so he addressed that pain. And instead of returning the insult, he looked to him and he says, "Are you from around here?" The man says, "No." He says, "You're a stranger?" He says, "Yes, I'm a stranger in this land." He said, "Do you have a place to stay? If you don't, you can stay in my home. Do you have something to eat? If you're hungry, you can come and eat with me." Empathy, feeling. The narration says, the man said that at that moment, I wanted the earth to open up and swallow me whole out of embarrassment. And I realized at that moment that my heart and my love belonged to none other but the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Because I came in with this notion that they're evil, that they were power hungry, everything that he was brainwashed with. All the Imam needed was, he didn't need logic, he didn't need intellect, he didn't need any of that. All he needed was a little bit of empathy. So, direct control, number one. Number two is indirect control. And number three is no control. There are things that you're simply not going to be able to control. Let me read this for you. He says, no control problems involve taking the responsibility to change the line on the bottom of our face. What's the line on the bottom of our face? It's a smile. It says you have to smile about things that you don't have control. To genuinely and peacefully accept these problems and learn to live with them, even though we don't like them. Does this sound familiar? In this way, we do not empower these problems to control us. You give power to problems so that they control you and they influence you. When you have no direct control over them, you're giving them power that they don't deserve. Many of us are giving... I heard someone say this one time. He said, we're giving people mental real estate and they're not paying their rent. They're not paying their mortgage. We're empowering people beyond what they're truly due. And of course, he says, we share in the spirit embodied. And of course, hopefully no one ever has to be part of this group. But he brings a prayer from Alcoholics Anonymous. He says the following: Lord, when you find yourself in a situation of no control, he says, Lord, give me the courage to change the things which can and ought to be changed. Give me the courage to change the things which can and ought to be changed. The serenity to accept the things which cannot be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. Courage with the things that can be changed, serenity with the things that cannot be changed, and most importantly, wisdom to know the difference between the two. Because some of the things in our life, they can be changed. We're just not doing anything about it. We're giving our emotional energy to the things that really cannot be changed in our life. So that's the mark of influence. That's the mark of a leader. And that's where leadership starts with ourselves. So when you look at the example of the 8th Imam, Al-Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida alayhi salam, you find someone who was full of empathy, emotional intelligence, someone that was in tune with his people that he was leading. Someone who was connected to the people that claimed to follow him. There's an example where one of his companions, Ali ibn Yaqtin, was a prominent minister in the government of the Abbasids. So one day Ali ibn Yaqtin is given a gift by the caliph. He's given an amount of money. He's given money and robes, silk robes to wear. So he takes it directly to the home of the Imam as a gift. So regifting existed long before we were doing it. So he re-gifted it, and a great gift to re-gift, straight to the Imam. So what did the Imam do? The Imam, he took the money, he accepted the gift of money, but he gave him back the robes. He said, why? These are new robes, these are new threads. Why are you not accepting them? He said, it's for your own good. Keep them with you. It's for your own good, I'm telling you. Little did he know that the caliph had sent 2 spies, 2 witnesses, to see what he was going to do with the gift. And so they went back and they snitched, and they told the caliph that he took it to Ali ibn Musa Rida. So he summoned him. He said, give me back what I gave you, or else it's your head. He gave him back the robes, and he gave him back money, because money was coins. Didn't make a difference. They didn't have a special, they weren't watermarked or whatever. It was coins. this is a person that was in touch. He knew the dangers surrounding and the implications surrounding his choice of actions and his behaviors, and he was always in that protective state. I mentioned the narration the other day where a man comes to the 8th Imam and he says, I want you to pray for me. And he says, not only do we pray for you, God gives us the ability to see what's going on in your lives every day and every night, and we're watching over you, and we're praying for you, we're cheering on for you. We want you to be successful. So he was a man not a man of worldly embellishments, a man of integrity. It's said that Abdullah ibn Matar, who was a companion, he was one day asked by Al-Ma'mun al-Abbasi. He was asked, he said, describe to me the Ahlul Bayt, and this man was very poetic. He said, and he began to describe Ali ibn Musa Rada. He said, this is a man who's clay, meaning that the original source material that he was created out of, this is a man whose clay was plunged into the waters of Risala. Plunged into the waters of the message. Meaning that the message wasn't a cloth that they wore and then they took off when they went home. The message that they delivered was who they were on the inside. The same person that they were on the outside, it was the same person that they were on the inside. And so he talks about the musk of guidance and the amber of piety. The view of the Imam, because if you study this politically, you find that Al-Imam Rida alayhi salam, one of the highlights of his life is that he was asked by the Caliph to be the next in line to the throne, the wasi. And of course, Al-Ma'mun had his own political ambitions. He knew that, because he was ruling in Persia, and that a lot of the people there were already followers of the Ahlul Bayt, so to win their votes over, he would use him as his heir apparent, and then when he wanted to get rid of him, he would do that. And that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what Al-Ma'mun did. And so his idea of governance was that governance means nothing and it's worthless if you don't achieve the aims of securing welfare and security for people. So Harun appoints, Al-Ma'mun appoints the Imam as his heir apparent. And that's when the problems began. That's when the real challenges he began to face. Why? Because we're talking about influence. And yes, the higher in the levels of leadership that you elevate, it becomes easier to influence, but that does not mean that challenges disappear. So you go from one form of challenges to another set of challenges. Now, when you're influencing people, now you have to make sure that you're doing the right thing. It's the example of someone who has no children versus the one who has children or grandchildren. Now you have an example to set. Now you have people that are following you. Now it becomes more important than ever to do the right thing because you understand that people are always following you. So that influence also brought some challenges. And so that's when he decided to end the life of the Imam. And there's a long story behind it, the different political back and forth that happened. But I want to share with you this and just end on this, because the Imam, why he was so outstanding, it wasn't because of his positional leadership. It wasn't because he was appointed as the heir to Al-Ma'mun. It was because of level 5 leadership, pinnacle, the fact that he stood for something that people began to follow him. One of the Arab poets, he describes the Imam in the following way, and I'll end with this. This poet, Abu Firas al-Hamdani, he was the cousin of Saif al-Dawla al-Hamdani. The Hamdanis were a family who had a political dynasty. And as the Abbasid dynasty began to decline, there were different family dynasties that began to pop up and appear in different places, in Syria, in Persia, different little pockets of resistance and groups that became autonomous. This group, the Hamdani family, ruled in two places, one in Aleppo and one in Damascus. So there were two dynasties. And Abu Firas al-Hamdani was he was a poet. He was very eloquent, and he was known for writing, one of his more famous poems was Al-Hamdaniya, which is a more than a 200-line poem, of course, praising his own family and putting down the Abbasids. And so when he talks about the Ahlul Bayt versus the Abbasids, he says, لَيْسَ الرَّشِيدُ كَمُوسَى فِي الْقِيَاسِ. He says, if you were to compare al-Rashid, the person that you call al-Rashid, Harun al-Abbasi, and if you look at Orientalists, they call that era where Harun was ruling the Islamic Golden Age, or the Islamic Golden Era. He says, لَيْسَ الرَّشِيدُ كَمُوسَى فِي الْقِيَاسِ. If you compare him to Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam, the seventh Imam, he says he doesn't stack up, he doesn't square up. وَلَا مَأْمُونُكُمْ كَالرِّضَى إِنْ أَنصَفَ الْحَكَمُ. He says, to be completely honest and to be completely fair, Al-Ma'mun does not compare to Al-Ridha either. Al-Ma'mun was a man who, his authority was positional. He demanded people's authority. The Mihna, the Inquisition, took place during his time. He demanded people's allegiance. Whereas Al-Imam Ridha alayhi salam did the exact opposite. He won the hearts of the people. And it's because of this that 1400 years later, if you ask people where is Ma'mun buried, most people don't even know. If you ask most people where Harun is buried, they don't know. Harun is buried right by Al-Imam al-Ridha, by the way. But most people don't know this. And nobody really cares. But when you begin to win the hearts of people, when you love people, when you honor people, when you influence not by command, but through respect, through empathy, through having sympathy with the people. And that was the case with the eighth Imam. Never saw himself as someone who was above the people. Never saw himself as someone who was greater than the people. One narration tells us that one day the Imam walked into a public bathhouse, and that was a common thing at the time where people would use public bathhouses. And by the way, this is not only when he was the Imam, but also when he had become the heir to the throne. That a man turned to him and he said, yo, whoever's there, the guy who walked in, come and scrub my back. The Imam didn't say, who do you think you're talking to? I am Ali ibn Musa Ridha. He went and he scrubbed his back, he took care of him. The man turned around and he didn't know how to react. He began to apologize, but the Imam said, look, I'm not above anyone. It's okay. That was his style of leadership. It was servant leadership. So when you don't see yourself as above people, trying to manipulate people, trying to influence them in certain ways, that's when you begin to win the hearts of people. And the most important thing, my friends, and the last message is, we need to work on winning the hearts, number one, of our family members. Before going out and try to make the world happy. Work with your family, your parents, the ones that you're able to work with. Your parents, your siblings, your spouses, your children. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us, to count us among those who receive the shafa'ah of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring relief and sustenance to all of those worldwide. There are multiple requests, brothers and sisters, for people around the world that are ill, they are ailing. There have been multiple requests to remember them in our prayers. Let us remember them in these final nights of Safar. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring them relief and assistance to all of those who are ill, to all of those who are suffering with poverty, with ailments, war, famine. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to look upon them a look of mercy and generosity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك قاضي الحاجات إنك على كل شيء قدير برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.